Morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Thanks for being here. We had our first in-person and hybrid caucus meeting of the year. It was good to see everyone who was back in town for our first full week of the second session of the 117th Congress. Democrats are looking forward to continuing to deliver for the American people, to get things done, to work on the economy and inflation, continue to create millions of good-paying jobs as we have done, but also, of course, to defend our democracy. At a moment where we are seeing a voter suppression epidemic take place all across America. And it didn't have to be this way. We just marked the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. We know that was a violent attack on the Capitol, the Congress, the Constitution, and the country, incited by the former twice impeached so-called President of the United States of America. It was an inflection point in our country and for our democracy. Democracy did prevail that day. The peaceful transfer of power subsequently prevailed on January 20th of 2021. But instead of running toward democracy, which reasonable people on the other side of the aisle should have done, the vast majority of them have run away from our democracy. That's why it's under assault. The pillar of our democracy, of course, is the constitutionally protected right to vote. The ability of the American people to determine who should represent their interests at all levels of government. That is what government of the people, by the people, and for the people is all about. That is the principle that Joe Biden is in Georgia today defending. That is what the Freedom to Vote Act that has been authored by Joe Manchin is all about. That is what the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is all about. And when did voting rights become such a partisan thing? Part of the Republicans' electoral strategy. Their invidious quest for power. When did that happen? Because for the vast majority of the decades following the Voting Rights Act, initially signed into law in 1965, voting outside of the Deep South was largely something that was embraced by both parties. In fact, every time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized and signed back into law, it occurred 4 times. It was signed back into law by a Republican president. 1970, Richard Nixon, of all people. 1975, Gerald Ford. 1982, Ronald Reagan. 2006, George W. Bush. What happened? Was it the election of Barack Obama? What happened? The voting rights now is a partisan thing. And Republicans are largely allergic to the notion of one person, one vote, intent on suppressing the ability of people, particularly in certain communities of color, to participate in our democracy. And so we understand the stakes are very high, and we're thankful that there's going to be movement over the next few days and activity in the Senate. We support that fully, and no matter what it takes, we're going to defend our democracy, we're going to protect the right to vote, we're going to continue America's long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. I yield now to our Vice Chair, Pete Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy New Year. As the Chairman mentioned, the House Democratic Caucus is completely supportive of efforts to protect our democracy. We saw, in my work on the January 6th committee, we've seen what this means. We've seen how important and fragile our democracy is, and we remain committed to continue to work to protect it at each and every turn. I look forward to my continued work with my colleagues in a nonpartisan way on that committee, and our work as House Democrats to ensure that we strengthen the pillars of our democracy, support and lift up the work that is going on in the Senate, and ensure that every individual has a right, has a protection to vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Pete. Questions?
I would like to ask about voting rights. So there's some news coming out that with the potential that this voting rights bill may fail in the Senate, bipartisan group is working on a more modest version. I'm wondering if Democrats in the House would be willing to push through something more modest just for the sake of trying to push forward the voting rights agenda.
Well, at this point, I support, and I believe every single member of the House Democratic Caucus supports the Freedom to Vote Act authored by Senator Joe Manchin and the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that will repair the damage that was done by the Supreme Court to voting rights in 2013 with the Shelby County versus Holder decision, a terrible decision that will go down in history like some other decisions that the Supreme Court has issued around Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, and things of that nature. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the two pieces of voting rights legislation that are live in the Senate are what the Senate should move on.
Just to can I follow up real quick on that? If there was a bill that came out that had some bipartisan things, like just a less pieces of legislation, maybe it removed the mail-in ballots, but it kept the extended period for the extended early voting period, would you support that, or what must be in a piece of legislation that you guys, like what's a deal breaker for you guys in the House, the Democrats there?
Well, I don't want to comment on anything other than the bills that we believe right now are necessary to defend our democracy. If we reach a point in time where the Senate, for whatever the reason, is unable to break through the filibuster, which they should deal with, and invoke cloture, then I'm happy at that point in time to evaluate what the other alternatives are, but we're not at that point right now. Alternate both sides.
Thank you. Speaker Pelosi in December rejected the idea of a stock trading ban for members of Congress and their spouses, citing the fact that we're a free market. But this is an idea that has between 67 and 76% support, depending on what poll you look at. And Punchbowl News did report this morning that Leader McCarthy is at least interested in the idea. And so I'm wondering, do you support banning members of Congress and their spouses from trading stocks? And do you think that this is something that Democrats as a whole can get behind, given the implications for ethics, given what the proponents of that say about its importance to democracy, and despite Pelosi's opposition?
I support continuing to make sure that everyone complies with the law as it is right now, and we're always open to ideas that members put into the public domain moving forward. However, with respect to Kevin McCarthy, does anyone take this guy seriously on any issue, particularly as it relates to ethics? Like, we passed H.R. 1. That is a massive, historic democracy reform bill to deal with a whole host of issues: voting reform, lobbying reform, electoral reform, campaign finance reform. And he was a hard no. He doesn't want to disrupt the system. He is part of the status quo system that defends the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. That's what the GOP tax scam was all about. So, of course, we're always open to any ideas that reasonable members put into the public domain. But we certainly aren't going to be lectured on ethics by Kevin McCarthy, of all people.
Well, shouldn't you all get behind this idea then?
We're happy to. I'm unfamiliar with the legislation. It hasn't been presented to me. No member has talked to me about it. And of course, I'm open to having any conversations with any members. Go to the back.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I know you just put out a letter to some of your colleagues announcing that you're canceling the Democratic retreat for next month. Given
Postponing.
that, pardon me?
Postponing.
postponing, well, but still, out of concern, for the pandemic. But, given that you've got, 60-plus members who, want to vote by proxy, the case count that's increasing here in Congress, how concerned are you about being able to get your work done, especially when we're looking at other industries across this country that are being impacted by shortages right now?
Well, we're going to continue to get our work done, and that is our commitment to the American people, and we've done it all the way through this deadly, once-in-a-century pandemic. The Capitol Hill physician provided us with guidance as it relates to a large gathering at this particular point in time. We received that guidance and have acted upon it, but we certainly intend to reschedule the in-person Democratic Issues Conference. There's so much for us to discuss as a family, and we look forward to that taking place. In terms of continuing to get our work done, I think President Biden has an incredible record to be proud of. 6.4 million jobs created in the last year. That's more than any first year of a president in American history, and more jobs that have been created in any year in the last 8 decades. The unemployment rate is now down to 3.9%. At the same time, wages are up. And I believe it's about 84% of the jobs that were lost as a result of the pandemic have been regained. Is there still work to do? Yes. But I think President Biden, House Democrats, Senate Democrats have already demonstrated our ability to continue to get work done in an incredible way for the people and to deliver for everyday Americans. Pete?
Mr. Jeffries, 36 million households were getting child tax credit payments every month. They won't this month. Are Democrats considering anything separate from Build Back Better to get that policy continued?
Well, I want to yield to Pete on this, who's been very involved and sits on the Appropriations Committee. But it's my hope and expectation that we are going to be able to arrive at an agreement with the Senate, including Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, around a Build Back Better Act that creates good-paying jobs, that preserves the child tax credit, that addresses the climate crisis, and that lowers costs, lowers housing costs, health care costs, lowers the high price of life-saving prescription drugs, particularly insulin, but a whole host of other drugs, and really delivers, for the American people. Those conversations, as I understand it, are ongoing amongst the Senate colleagues and with the White House. We, of course, are supportive of that, and it's my expectation that we're going to be able to get something done.
The child tax credit was instrumental to lifting families out of poverty, and it's a key program within Build Back Better. The House did our part in sending that over to the Senate. We encourage our Senate colleagues, and we have been vocal about this, especially about this proposal, because it affects children and families and because of the benefits that it's led to over the last 6 months. But on the 15th of this month, we understand that families won't receive that benefit. And we encourage the Senate to come back to the table to work through this and to ensure that those families receive the benefits they need. As the chairman mentioned, Build Back Better is about lowering prescription drug costs, lowering costs to families, health care. All of those pieces are so instrumental to everyday Americans, and it's what the policy and the proposal was built to do, and we want it continued, especially this provision. Thanks.
Hey, Mr. Jeffries, Joe Manchin just said he's not sure he's going to be able to watch the president's speech today. Stacey Abrams isn't attending. Your fellow Democrats concerned this speech is not set up to change hearts and minds the way it might need to?
Well, I think that it's appropriate that the president is leaning in to this issue in a variety of different ways, including traveling to Georgia, the heart of Dixie, a place that John Lewis called home, to talk about the importance of the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and this principle of one person, one vote, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The president has the largest megaphone of anyone in the world and I embrace the fact that he is using it to talk about voting rights.
I have a foreign relations question. So, we just heard from Whip Scalise, who was talking about if they take the majority, which I know you probably don't want to think about that, but if they did, they'd focus more on holding China accountable. You guys have passed some legislation. Biden signed the Forced Labor Prevention Act. Do you think that more needs to be done to hold China accountable? And if so, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think as President Biden has made clear, China is an adversary, a geopolitical adversary, certainly economically, and, in other strategic ways across the world. President Biden spoke to that in a very clear-throated way when he came to talk to a joint session of Congress last year. I expect that he will continue to lay out a vision for dealing with the China issue, and I look forward to that vision. I don't want to get out ahead of it, but I believe we've already acted in certain important ways, including making sure that we invest in our infrastructure here in America in a meaningful, comprehensive, transformational way that will allow us not just to compete with China, but to own the 21st century economy, particularly by having a first-class infrastructure. They were running circles around us in terms of infrastructure. And in the previous 4 years, we had infrastructure week. Every other week, Donald Trump couldn't get a single road fixed. But Joe Biden will now make sure, as a result of this bipartisan infrastructure agreement, that we will have the best infrastructure in the world, and certainly that puts us in a strong position in terms of competing with China.
Congressman, something a little more local. There's been some pushback to the Manhattan DA's new policy that would include instructions to his prosecutors to stop seeking prison sentences for many crimes and to downgrade felony charges to cases including armed robberies and drug dealing. What would you say to your constituents who would have to deal with some of the backlash to some of these new policies? I realize that your district is in Queens, but still, some of these issues would have to go over to your constituents.
The district actually is largely in Brooklyn, with a little bit of Queens.
A little bit of Queens as well, still.
Correct, but not Manhattan. And I'm unfamiliar with the Manhattan DA's policy. I am familiar with the fact that Mayor Adams has been very clear that public safety is a prerequisite to prosperity. And as a former decorated law enforcement officer who also was a captain and a lieutenant, but walked the streets protecting New Yorkers during a very difficult time, I think that we are in good hands with Mayor Adams. I also can say that the Brooklyn District Attorney, who I work with closely, as a result of his efforts in balancing both public safety and justice, homicides were down in Brooklyn last year, shootings were down, violent crime was down. That's a good thing.
But do you think DA Bragg should be prosecuting these crimes?
I'm unfamiliar with his proposal.
Thank you. Since you guys have come back, we've obviously seen a dramatic spike in the Omicron variant. Unsurprisingly, Scalise was up here, obviously criticizing Democrats, Biden's response to it, but it is a message that actually has been resonating with voters. A lot of, including Democratic voters, wondering why they have to wait in lines for tests, waiting why these, promised home delivery tests haven't been made yet. What are Democrats trying to do right now? What is the message to make sure that voters, especially your own voting bloc, do trust you all with the pandemic, given that is really a big argument that Biden made on the campaign trail that he was going to be able to do?
Well, the Vice Chair and I have an agreement that he answers all difficult questions, so I'm going to yield to him. But President Biden has been a strong leader on the public health crisis and the pandemic. And this is a very difficult, once-in-a-century pandemic. And it's caused a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, a lot of death. But the fact that we at least are in a position to have fought through the Delta variant and emerged from it, and now we're fighting through the Omicron variant, and we will emerge from it. It's a testament to our leadership, President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, House Democrats, governors all across the country, mayors and others. But it's a testament to the resilience of the American people. And, you know, President Biden made the commitment that hundreds of millions of COVID-19 at-home testing kits will be made available to the American people, free. And that has happened. I've seen it in my own community, and I know it's happening in communities all across the country. The Omicron variant, while less lethal, is highly transmissible, and it's come in like a hurricane. And I'm confident that President Biden is doing what is necessary in an emergency to mobilize the resources that will help the American people get through this variant and ultimately crush this virus and get through this pandemic.
I thought the chairman did quite well with that. But what I would say is House Democrats continue to support the administration's proposals and their work to deliver at-home tests to Americans. They're going to stand up a hotline and have a website where Americans can register and can request one. Healthcare companies now are required to cover a number of tests per month, at-home tests. But specific to the PCR tests, we know that staffing has been an issue in many communities when it comes to this. We continue to need, as we've talked about many times, whether the issue was rental assistance or others, we need local government partners also standing up and working with us to deliver on that. And so many of these issues are federal funds through the American Rescue Plan that are implemented at the local level. And so we continue to need to work with our local partners to ensure that the staffing is adequate so Americans who want tests can get tests without waiting in a burdensome line. Thank you.
Any final questions? Is that a question in the back or no? No. All right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, oh yeah.